All right, I think I'm recording now. So far in the class, we have encountered two distinct but somewhat related notions of substance from Descartes and Spinoza separately. There's a lot of ideas that are covered in primary truths, and there's a lot of different ways that you can tackle it. But what I wanted to do with this 20-minute lecture is evaluate the ideas of Leibniz theory of substance that's presented here and compare and contrast those with the ideas of substance we've gotten from Descartes and Spinoza so far. Now, Descartes in the third meditation tells us that a substance is a thing capable of existing independently. We found out last week, this is aside from God, of course, or 2 weeks ago. And Cartesian substances are going to be characterized by one attribute. So if you're a thinking substance, you're characterized by the attribute of thought. If you're a bodily substance, you're characterized by the attribute of extension. And it's only one. We don't have any substances characterized by the attribute of thought and extension. And finally, for Descartes, there's numerous substances. There's at least one for all of the minds out there. There's at least one body, and there's God. Now, for Spinoza, Spinoza agrees in 1d3 that a substance has to be something that's capable of existing independently. And also agrees that substances are characterized by attributes, though he thinks there is only one substance, God or nature. And this substance is characterized by infinitely many attributes, all the attributes, just two attributes, depending on how you interpret that. But still, we see the parallels between Descartes and Spinoza. Independent existence, characterized by some attributes, number of substances is where it goes off. Now, what about Leibniz? What's Leibniz's theory of substance? Well, that's what we're going to look at today. The first mention of substance in primary truths comes in these two bits. The complete or perfect notion of an individual substance contains all its predicates, past, present, and future. And every individual substance contains in its perfect or complete notion the entire universe and everything that exists in it, past, present, and future. Now, when you add the claim that Leibniz thinks that if something's contained in the notion or the concept of something, it must have some grounds in the thing itself, this becomes even more startling than it might be at a first glance. A substance contains in itself all of its predicates, past, present, and future. If I'm going to go bald in the future, that's in a sense contained within me right now. I contain within me, if I'm a substance, a perfect notion of the entire universe, about things happening in galaxies far, far away from me. How does Leibniz get here to this surprising claim? Well, Leibniz starts with a theory of truth. And this is the predicate in notion theory. Because for Leibniz, something is true if and only if the predicate or the consequent is contained in the subject or antecedent. And this is the nature of truth in general, the connection between the terms of a statement, and that consists in this very thing. Now, this is a general theory of truth. This is supposed to cover all affirmative truths, whether universal or particular, necessary or contingent. And they're also supposed to take the form of predicating something of a subject. So, Forrest is bald. Mike is a professor. Philosophers are boring. These kinds of things. These predicate things of a subject. And these are all supposed to not just predicate them as a subject, but if true, only if the predicate is contained within the concept or notion of the subject. And I want to note that in this quote, it's not explicit that it's about concepts or notions, but as Leibniz makes clear when he discusses extrinsic denominations, that from this theory it follows that there are no purely extrinsic denominations which have absolutely no foundation in the thing denominated, for it's necessary that the notion of the subject denominated contain the notion of the predicate. So here we get two interesting things. One, the explicit statement of the notion version of the theory, which he also makes explicit when he presents the theory to Arnaud in the correspondence. But also we find, and this is the important bit from the lessons, that if it's contained within the concept or the notion of the thing, there has to be something some corresponding fact about that thing, something that has its basis in the substance itself, that makes it true. So he expresses this in another work, the Discourse on Metaphysics, as all true predication has its basis in the nature of things. So if truth is a matter of concept containment containment of predicate and subject, and has to do with the concepts, and if these concepts correspond to the things themselves, then when we reevaluate these quotes, it's clear to see why a substance would have to be the kind of thing that contains not just all of its past, present, and future predicates, but the perfect notion of the universe itself. And that's because if there are affirmative truths about my future or about my past, then those truths have to have a basis in me. If it's true that I was born in 1994, then there has to be some basis in me now that makes that true, because it can be affirmed of me now. If it's true that I'll go bald in 3 years, then there has to be something that has its basis in me now that makes it true that I'll go bald in 3 years. And further, there's truths that we can say relating me to literally anything in the universe. That I'm N miles away from Pluto, that I'm to the left of a door right now. Any of these facts about in the universe, there has to be something in me that these truths have their basis in, if they're going to be true at all. And Leibniz thinks that this has an interesting consequence for a theory of causation, or as he calls it, metaphysical action. He says, strictly speaking, one can say that no created substance, that's going to be the important asterisk on this theory, exerts a metaphysical action or influx on any other thing. Now, metaphysical action, as I've said, is just fancy talk for causation. Influx is a common theory of causation that was common at Leibniz's time. The idea was that causation is when something leaves one substance and goes into another, causing a change in it. But as you see in this quote, Leibniz finds this completely unintelligible. But if all the states about me, past, present, and future, have their basis in me, why would we need metaphysical action, as it were? This is what Leibniz is thinking. So here's a rather gruesome example. This weekend, I was fixing something and my knife slipped and it went into my finger. Now this damaged the skin. Assume that I'm a substance. If it's true that last weekend, my knife slipped and damaged my skin, if it's true that I damaged my skin, then there must be some basis in me for my skin being damaged, for it being true that my skin was damaged. And that's sufficient to explain that truth. If we have a sufficient explanation for the truth, why would we need to appeal to other substances like the knife as acting on or causing this change if its basis can, or if its truth can be explained in the substance that's based in? Now, this also allows Leibniz to avoid worries like Elizabeth had for Descartes. She, if you remember, worried how we can explain substances interacting with each other, specifically if there are distinct substances like a soul and a body. And Leibniz can extend this theory about substantial causal interactions to the soul and the body as well. Now, think about the damage in the skin that occurred alongside a pain in the soul, let's say. But that pain is a state of the soul. And if the soul is a substance, then it contains within it the basis for all past, present, and future truths. So we can explain why it's true that the soul felt a pain without having to appeal to the body acting on the soul. So this is, as Leibniz notes here, the hypothesis of concomitance, but you're probably more familiar with it under its more common name of the pre-established harmony. So this is pretty cool. So far we know that substances are things that express the past, present, and future of the entire universe, including themselves, that they're causally isolated from each other. But we now might want to know, how many of these substances are there? So Leibniz says here that every particle of the universe contains a world of an infinity of creatures. And if these creatures are going to be substances, then we have infinite many substances. Excuse me, infinitely many substances. So again, read this and go, well, why does he think this? Well, this comes from two rejections that Leibniz makes earlier in the primary truths, his rejection of vacuum and his rejection of atoms. There can be no vacuum for Leibniz for the same reason that there cannot be two individual things that differ in number alone. This is shown in page 32 of primary truths. This can't be because this would be a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, which he shows follows directly from the predicate in notion theory. The principle of sufficient reason states that for anything, there has to be a cause or a reason. So if there were two independent things that differed in number alone, they were qualitatively identical, we might say, well, there'd have to be a reason why they differed. But if they're qualitatively identical, they differ in number alone, there is no reason. But this is a violation of the principle of sufficient reason and therefore of the predicate in notion theory of truth. For the same reason, there can't be a vacuum because any 2 points in space in that vacuum would be identical. They would just differ in number alone. But by PSR, we can't have that. So there are no vacuums. There can be no atoms, and by atoms, we mean indivisible bodies. These are the atoms of Democritus, not the atoms of our contemporary physics. Because if there were an indivisible body and bodies are extended, there's no reason why that extension can't be divided further, because it's the nature of extension to take up space. And if you take up any amount of space, you can cut that amount of space in half, and then you can cut that amount in half and do that ad infinitum. So if there were indivisible atoms, there would have to be a reason why you couldn't divide it by space, but there is none, so the existence of an atom would violate the PSR. But if there is no vacuum, then all of space must be filled. And anything that's filling space, a body, would be infinitely divisible because there are no atoms. So all of space would have to be filled with infinite creatures. And even each of these creatures would be expressing the past, present, and future of the entire universe. So now we know that there are infinitely many causally independent substances, but what are these creatures? Are they bodies? Are they souls? What are they? Well, if they are going to be bodies, they can't be Cartesian bodies in the sense of being characterized by extension alone, where motion for Descartes was a modification of extension. Because Leibniz denies that these things are substances, but rather they're true phenomena like rainbows, where true phenomena are going to be things that are merely phenomena, they're merely appearances, but they have some basis in the world beyond. And this is a complicated idea that we can get into in Q&A for people that are interested. But the reason why extension can't be a substance is because there's going to be no determinate shapes in the world. Now, Leibniz has a very complicated argument for this that, again, we can get into in Q&A. But the basics of it is this. If there were bodies and they were substances, they'd have to express the entire universe. And that expression would have to have some basis in those things. Now, if they're just extension, the only thing they have is extension. And so for the continuous and infinite changes going on in the universe that's being expressed, there would have to be continuous and infinite changes in the extension or in the shape, because if it's extended, it has to be extended in a certain way, so we get a shape. But there is no definite shape that can express these infinite changes of the universe. So there can't be shapes. And if you don't have shapes, you can't have extension, pure extension. So if they're not bodies in the Cartesian sense, what do we have left? And Leibniz thinks that they're going to have to be something analogous to the soul. Now, the reason for this is that Leibniz thinks that for something to be real, it has to be grounded in a unity. But because there are no atoms, there are no unities of extension, because there's always going to be a plurality. Because for any bit of extension you have infinitely many divisions of that, because it's taking up space, and you can divide it infinitely many times. So there's never a body, there's always a plurality of bodies. And there's no unity, there's no bedrock that you get down to that can ground that plurality, the reality of it. So they can't be bodies. Now, a good candidate for unity is something like a mind or a soul. If you remember, Descartes thought that the mind was simple, it lacked parts. So whatever there is, there has to be a unity that grounds it, and that unity is going to have to be something analogous to a soul. So now we can talk about the three notions of substance that we have in R3, as they're sometimes called rationalists. Again, for Descartes, substances have to be able to exist independently. They're characterized by one attribute, and there's many of them. Excuse me. For Spinoza, they also have to be able to exist independently, but there's only one of them, and it's characterized by infinitely many attributes. Leibniz also agrees that substances have to exist independently, but he doesn't bring in this notion of attribute, or at least not explicitly. For him, a substance is something that expresses the entire universe, past, present, and future, and is something analogous to a soul. And there's going to be infinitely many of them. Thank you.